Hi everyone, I'm Josie Jaffrey and it's my slot on Yalk at Home, or at Home Yalk, which is the hashtag. Just want to make sure, can everyone hear me? If you can't hear me, let me know and I'll try and do something about it, but who knows. So first of all, I'd like to say a huge thank you to Joshua Winning, who's just done his little slot, which was amazing. I hope you managed to catch it. I think you can still go to his Twitter, which is, I believe, at Joshua Winning, in order to catch the catch up of his latest book. And also a huge thank you to Rachel Churcher, who set this up for us, so that we can do this little thing for you, even though we can't be at Yalk together this weekend, which is really sad for all of us. But, you know, there we are. We've got to adapt, haven't we, in a changing world. So I'm just going to give you a little bit of a rundown on my books, what I write, and then I'm going to read to you from The Gilded King, which is the first book in my YA fantasy series. And then afterwards, there'll be tons and tons of time for questions. But if you could please keep your questions to the end, that would be great, because I'm going to be looking at the book while I'm reading, and I'm just going to completely lose track of everything that's going on. I will try to keep on top of this, but this is my first live broadcast, so it may go slightly awry, so please bear with me. Thank you. So, my books. I've got 8 published so far. The series that I'm going to read from today is the Sovereign series. The first book in that series is The Gilded King. That's this one. And that's my YA fantasy series. That's a trilogy, that's 3 books. And I've got a 4-book paranormal romance series. That's the Solace Invicti series. This is the first book in that series. And I've just started a new series called the Seekers series, and this is the first book in that series. They're all set in the same world, and it's a world where vampires exist. So in the Solace Invicti series, there is a zombie apocalypse, and we get to the point where the only way that humans can survive the zombie apocalypse is by teaming up with the vampires, because the zombies are scared of the vampires, and the vampires also obviously have supernatural powers that can help them to overcome the zombies in a way that humans just can't, because they get infected, but the vampires do not. So that series, the Solace Invicti series, is the zombie apocalypse as it happens. Then Mayday, which is the first book in the Seeker series, this one that's just come out, that is a prequel that is the vampires living secretly before the zombie apocalypse happens. The book I'm going to read from today, The Gilded King, this is in the Sovereign series. In the Sovereign series, it's 500 years after the zombie apocalypse, and we're in a world where there is one city left that humans can live in, because basically all of the land has been contaminated by the zombie virus, and there is nothing that humans can do to get rid of it, from the land, from animals, from the water supply. So they are stuck in this one tiny civilization, and they're depending on the vampire nobles to look after them, basically, to get them what they need. And the vampires obviously depend on the humans because they need to drink human blood. And if the humans all get turned into zombies, then they can't. So there's this codependency that's going on. But in the Sovereign series, we're quite a long way down the line, and this codependency has been going on for a long time. Things are entrenched. And the main character, Julia, who we're about to hear from, I'm going to read from the very beginning of the book, she's starting to question the setup, how necessary it is, whether the vampire nobles are telling them the full truth. So I'm going to crack straight in with the reading. Julia's world was blue. Blue was everything. Blue was safe. Blue was home. How she longed to see red. She could just glimpse it from the alley in which she crouched. The forests of the red were ever present, cradling and encroaching on stone and blue paint. The tops of the trees danced over the stuccoed walls of the buildings that formed the blue, the last city on earth. "They're coming out," Claudia whispered. Julia looked away from the tree line that marked the edge of her world and turned to follow her friend's gaze. The doors of the temple were swinging open, soundless and majestic. Their silence left a vacuum where there should have been noise. She wanted to scream into it, to fill the void. Instead, she wrestled another weed from between the paving stones and threw it hard into the trug. Claudia's fingers clasped at Julia's arm in excitement, her eyes fixed on the door across the square. "Here they come," she said. "You see them every day, Claude. They're just people." "Not like this, though. It's Inauguration Day. Why aren't you excited?" Julia couldn't have cared less about it, because it had nothing to do with her. She wrapped her fist around the leaves of a dandelion and pulled, leaning back to put her body weight behind it, but she'd been too rough. She fell onto her backside as the leaves snapped off in her fingers, leaving the roots in the ground and a feeling of tight impotence in her chest. The procession spilled out into the square as Julia brushed the leaves from her hands. The new candidates followed the priestess like little ducklings following their mother, crowding close with the small, shuffling steps in their eagerness. There were only 7 girls this year. Julia recognised all of them. The blue wasn't that big. "There she is," Claudia sighed. She didn't have to point because they both knew whom she meant. Marcella. The girl was so shockingly beautiful that anyone would think she was already a noble. No one had been surprised when she was chosen as a candidate. Her skin was smooth and flint black, illuminated so perfectly by the sunshine that it was as though it were worshipping her with its rays. She was average in height, but proportioned like a taller woman, with long, delicate limbs and a graceful neck. Her hair seemed to crown her head in a riot of dark curls. All of the girls were dressed in their best clothing, showing off swathes of skin dripping in jewels. Most of them seemed weighed down by their decoration, as though they had been subsumed by it, but Marcella wore it lightly. Nothing could make her any more or less stunning than she already was. "Look at Diana's hair," Claudia whispered. "Isn't it gorgeous?" The girl was taller than the others, nearly as tall as the priestess herself. Her blonde hair was teased into a fountain on the top of her head, so it spilled in tumbles down the sides of her face. Combined with her jewelled orange dress, Julia thought it made her look like a wilted carrot. "It's stupid," she said. "Oh, you think everything's stupid." "Only things that aren't real. This is real," Julia said, pushing her fingernails between the paving slabs as she sought out the elusive dandelion root. "Dirt is real, earth is real, work is real. All that glitter out there in the square is just make-believe." Claudia sat back on her heels and stared at the girls as the priestess led them towards their new lodgings. They would be housed in the grander buildings now, the ones whose gardens and kitchens Julia and Claudia were too lowly to tend. "That's not what you really think," Claudia said. "You weren't like this last year." "Yeah, well, last year I was stupid too." "Because you thought you might be one of them." Julia shook her head with a bitter laugh. "I never thought that," she said, but it wasn't entirely true. It was too late for them both now. They'd been assigned to their rank months ago, and with it went Julia's hopes for a better life. They'd never be anything other than servers from now until the day they died. Cleaning, cooking, gardening, laundering, and waiting on the nobles would take up the rest of their lives. And feeding, of course, but Julia wasn't even good enough for that, apparently. It was a matter of taste, they said, and she had too little delicacy about her. "This is the last morning we'll spend together," Claudia said quietly. "I know." "Then don't ruin it." "I'm sorry, I know," Claudia said. "You wanted to be a candidate." She was dead wrong. What Julia wanted, what her heart screamed for, was the freedom she imagined to exist in the red. That wasn't a desire she could show to anyone, not even Claudia. In a city of many taboos, a human leaving the blue was the biggest. They said it was dangerous and that no humans had ever returned alive. But if they did survive out there, then why would they come back? If it hadn't been for Claudia, Julia would have left without a backward glance. She was nothing here, and she would always be nothing if she stayed. But she wasn't ready to risk death for the faint possibility of liberty. Not yet. Her eyes strayed back towards the treetops as she rose to her feet and wiped her muddy fingers on the front of her cloak. Clouds were being blown across the sky by a wind that began to batter the edges of the forest. She pulled the sides of her hood tighter around her face, suddenly cold. "Are you thinking about them again?" Claudia asked. "Do you think about yours?" "Sometimes," she said, picking up the trug as she stood. "I wonder what my father was thinking. He just can't have loved me that much, I guess." "Or maybe he loved your mother too much." "Maybe." Claudia fiddled with the weeds they'd collected. "Either way, they're gone now." "Well, at least your parents weren't traitors," Julia said. Claudia met her eye with a wry smile. "Not both of them, anyway," she said. "But one was bad enough to make me a server. The other was good enough to make you an attendant." Despite herself, Claudia smiled at the reminder of her recent preferment. If there had been any justice, then she would have been a candidate. They both knew it. She was sweet in nature and appearance, the perfect combination. It still hadn't allowed her to follow in her mother's footsteps, but if she couldn't be a candidate, then an attendant was the next best thing. She would remain a server, but of a higher class, assigned to one of the nobles as their own. It seemed like the worst of both worlds to Julia, still being a server, just with even greater scrutiny, but Claudia was delighted. Julia didn't want to spoil this for her. I wonder if he'll be handsome, Claudia said, her voice wispy and soft. Maybe we'll fall in love. Maybe he'll love me so much that he'll insist the Empress makes me a candidate, so we can be together forever. Trust Claude to view her new servitude as romantic. How do you even know he'll be a he? Julia said. That's what they said when they told me it was happening. They even gave me his name, Rufus. Latin, Julia said. Yep, just like us. He was born here then. It sounds like it, doesn't it? I wonder how old that makes him. He must be young. The Blue's been here for hundreds of years, Claude. Fine, relatively young then. Yes, Julia said, unable to resist teasing her, but he might not look it. Age wasn't simple in the Blue. These days every candidate was under 30, but admission to the ranks of immortality hadn't always been so controlled. Most of the nobles were frozen in their prime, but some were as gnarled as the old woman who ran the kitchen. Claudia's face screwed up in distaste. I hadn't considered that. I'm sure he'll be wonderful. And handsome, Claudia said, smiling winsomely. I'm sure. And heartless, Julia thought, just like they all are. So that's the end of the bit I wanted to read for you. That's the very beginning of The Gilded King. And although that bit is all Claudia, and the first chapter is all Claudia, there are actually two point of view characters in the book, and the book alternates between the two of them. One of them is Julia, who's the human servant, basically, and the other is Cam, who is one of the silver, and he's been about in the previous books as well. So you might recognise him if you've read the other ones in the series. Right, if you've got any questions that you'd like to ask, then crack on. I'll just have a little scroll and see if I've got any already. No? Well, do crack in with your questions. If you've got any, then just put them in the box. Also, I'll try and keep an eye on Twitter. Okay, so Rachel asked, what inspired you to write in this setting? I think because the first thing that I wrote was the Solace Invicti series. So the first thing that I wrote was the book that's about the zombie apocalypse that happens and that gets the vampires out into the notice of the humans. And it seemed like the natural extension of that, particularly given the end of the Solace Invicti series, which I'm not going to talk about because I don't want to spoil it for everyone. It felt like the natural thing was to look into the future and to ask, okay, so we've had the zombie apocalypse, we've got the vampires in charge, but what happens next? What happens ages into the future? Do we get to the point where we've got this sort of dystopian establishment? So that's where I wanted to take it, and that's where it went, really. So that was the genesis of that. Thank you, Rachel, for that. Then Josh asks, what's the toughest thing about writing fantasy and what's the best? I've never really thought about the toughest thing because I never really considered writing anything that wasn't fantasy, or at least had a fantasy element. So I think probably from a craft perspective, the world building would be the hardest bit of fantasy. My first book was A Bargain in Silver, the first book in the Solace Invicti series, and the world building was slightly challenging, but not as much as it has been in, for example, the Sovereign series, of which The Gilded King is the first, because with something like A Bargain in Silver, which is sort of more paranormal romance, urban fantasy, so it's a fantasy that's taking place in a world that already exists. The world is already set up for you, you've just got to write how it devolves. Whereas with the Sovereign series, it's 500 years in the future, the world is completely different, it's unrecognisable, it's not the world that we know today. So that's probably the biggest challenge. In terms of what the best thing is about writing in a fantasy setting, I think it's that you can control everything to make the message whatever you want it to be. And, you know, you don't have to have the nitty-gritty of certain aspects if you don't want them in. So, you know, you really get to choose how your world looks. So if, for instance, you want to write a world without misogyny, without prejudice, blah, 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 you can write whatever you want. Or if, like me, you're interested in those subjects and want to examine them a bit more, so you want to heighten them, then you can also do that. So whatever the message, whatever the thrust of the story that you're trying to tell, whatever the moral, if you like, although I don't like to think of my books as being moralistic, and I don't think they are, whatever the thrust is, whatever the theme, you can really enhance it through fantasy, I think, in a way that is a little bit more tricky if you're writing contemporary. So thank you, Josh, for that question. I will scroll down. Okay. Do you want people to read Solace Invicti first? I think it depends very much on the audience, honestly. If you're a paranormal, romance, urban fantasy fan, then I would maybe go for Solace Invicti, but because it's the first thing I wrote, it's sort of like the centre of the axle that holds the rest in, you know? So I actually think The Gilded King is a really good jumping on point, particularly for a younger audience, because the Sovereign series is young adult, and the Solace Invicti series and Seeker series are not. The Seeker series has a very young adult voice, so it's quite accessible, it's quite fast moving, and it's quite chatty and fun and light and humorous. But at the same time, it is primarily targeted at an adult audience as urban fantasy rather than YA fantasy. But I think, you know, you can really pick up wherever you want to, start wherever you want to at the beginning of one of the series, and you won't find yourself lost. So thank you very much for that question. And there was one more. Why vampires? Vicky asks. So I've always loved vampires. Vampires have always been a thing for me. I grew up on Buffy, basically, like I think a lot of my contemporaries did. And I never really looked back. It's funny because when Buffy came out, it wasn't, you know, I wasn't into vampires at that point. I didn't think they were the best thing ever. But it was that combination of vampires and romance that you got that started with Buffy and then kind of accelerated. We had that sort of 10-year period, I think, where vampires were a really big deal, and they were incorporated in this sort of these different romantic settings where sometimes they were a sexy thing, sometimes they weren't a sexy thing. And then, you know, we transitioned and we had comedy vampires instead. And there was just something about it that was so joyful. Honestly, I think it was probably more the genre that brought me to vampires than it was vampires that brought me to the genre. I think it was just that there was a lot of stuff that came out that was vampires that was very accessible. And that kind of created a fixation with me. So I love vampires. I'm a zombie fan too. I do enjoy zombie fiction. But for romance, I think it's because I fell into a paranormal romance hole and started reading everything by Nalini Singh and Carolyn Sparks, and Gail Carriger is a particular favourite of mine as well. And I think when you're having your sort of formative years of reading, where you're suddenly, and for the first time for me, reading things that weren't just whatever's on your parents' bookshelves, you get to pick what it is you want to read. Whatever it is that you pick up for the first time, I think that ends up having a fairly special place in your heart. And for me, that was vampire romance. So there we go. That's how it happened. Right. Let me just. Okay. Do you primarily read fantasy, or do you like to read across genres? I read just about everything. So the only thing that I don't honestly read a huge amount of is literary fiction. I maybe read 3 or 4 literary fiction books a year, which, given that I read about 100, 150 books a year, is a very, very small proportion of my overall reading. I read a fair amount of contemporary. I read mostly fantasy, urban fantasy, paranormal romance. I read a lot of Regency romance or Highlander romance. If I'm having one of those moments where I'm just feeling a little bit stressed by the world, so, you know, the past 4 months basically in their entirety, then it's pretty much romance that I go to. Recently, it's been contemporary romance a little bit as well, which is a strange one for me, but I've been really enjoying it. So yeah, I read just about everything, and I try to read widely. So I deliberately try and pick different books that I can put on my list, to make sure that I'm reading a good spread, reading new stuff, reading old stuff that I didn't pick up and I should have done. So yeah, just about everything. Thank you, Vicky, for that question. What are you reading at the moment? Well, I have just started. So I've been reading Jay Kristoff's Lotus War series. I've read the first one. I'm halfway through the second one, and I'm afraid I have to confess I've slightly hit a wall with it. It is not 100% gelling with me. The thing I'm reading at the moment that I am really enjoying, I've just read M.R. Carey's The Girl with All the Gifts, which I adored. I thought it was brilliant. I knew I was going to love it because I've loved M.R. Carey ever since he did the Lucifer comic books. I just think he's great. I love his writing. I loved his Felix Castor books. I think he's fab. And when I found out that he had written a zombie book, I knew that I was going to love it. I should have read it ages ago. I don't know why I didn't. So I've just finished that. Absolutely loved it. Brilliant. Just about to move on to The Boy on the Bridge, which is the sequel to that. So for those of you who don't know, the basic premise is that the main character in The Girl with All the Gifts is a girl who has a virus that she doesn't know about. And it's a sort of zombie-ish thing. And it's such an interesting setup because it's mostly from her point of view, but he writes it so deftly and the pace is so good. I loved it. It was brilliant. So thank you very much for that question. When did you start writing? I've had little forays. So I started writing novels at school, and I'd write sort of 15 pages and go, oh, one day this might be a novel, and then just nothing. Obviously, I think that's what happens, isn't it? When you write stories in school, you go, this will be a great novel, and it'll be wonderful and amazing. And then other stuff happens because you're 16 and you've got more important things to worry about than being an author. So I think I certainly had my early forays. And then thereafter, in university, I wrote about a quarter of a novel, which in retrospect was dark and self-indulgent and weird. And I'm really, really glad that at some point I consigned it to the technology dump heap. And I've got no idea where it is, somewhere in the ether, probably dead, let's hope dead. And then maybe 2 years after I had had that little foray, I started writing a vampire book. And I didn't get very far. I didn't plot it because I never ever used to plot anything. And just got like the first bit of the story. I had maybe a few scenes that were absolutely set in my mind as this needs to happen. So I had my few scenes that I wrote down, and they worked well, or well enough. And then I put that away and sort of forgot about it. And then I thought, oh, I know, I'll write a graphic novel because I draw as well. So I thought, I'll do all the drawing, I'll do my art, I'll put together a graphic novel, it'll be great. And then I realised that it takes an entire day just to ink a page. And then you've got an entire day shading a page. So just to get one page done, it's 2 days work. And then you've got to have the writing time. So there was no way that I was ever going to have time to do that. So that I think I got about 15 pages into and then ditched. And then eventually, much, much, much later, I think it will have been, 2014, I started writing A Bargain in Silver. And that was the first book that I managed to finish and actually get over the line, which I self-published in January 2015, and I've not really stopped since. So yeah, it's been pretty good fun, and I'm not sure that I can stop now. I think you just carry on. Once you've started, that's it. Right, I better wrap up. I'm sorry, I've only got 1 minute left. I must tell you about the author who's on after me, and that is Judith Crow, who's going to be talking to you about her historical fantasy Dance with Me, and she'll be doing a reading for you. If you'd like to go over to her Twitter next, her profile is at JZ_K, so it's spelt out in letters. So it's JAYZ_KAY. So that's where you can find her. If you like the reading from the Gilded King, then you can get the Gilded King for free. That's my pinned tweet. It's free to download, so check that out on my profile. Thanks again to Rachel for setting this up, and thank you again to Josh for his great session before mine. And thank you very much to all of you for coming and for all of your questions. If you've got any more, please do just tweet them to me and I'll answer for you. Thanks very much. Enjoy the rest of At Home Yalk.